Hey there, you ready to dive into this?
Absolutely.
It sent over a really powerful YouTube video,
Yeah,
an interview with Eloisa, the author of Maldita Coroza,
I saw that one.
which translates to Damn Shell.
Yeah,
It's about her experience using EMDR therapy to deal with childhood trauma.
right.
And honestly, even just watching it, I felt like I learned so much.
It's interesting how this deep dive you've brought us speaks to so many things at once.
Totally.
Personal experience, this relatively new kind of therapy, and even the science behind how our memories work.
So Maldita Coroza,
Yeah.
it centers around a pivotal event in Eloisa's life,
Okay.
the death of her mother when she was just 13.
Oh, wow.
But what makes it even more complex is how her family dealt with the grief afterward.
Yeah, and as we see in the video, their way of coping was basically to shut down any talk about it.
It's heartbreaking.
They got rid of her mother's belongings, avoided mentioning her.
And you can imagine the impact that had on Eloisa.
It's almost like they tried to erase the fact that she'd ever existed.
She talks about developing this metaphorical shell, a defense mechanism to avoid dealing with that immense pain.
Right.
Like her mind and body just couldn't process it at that age.
It's a natural human response to trauma, unfortunately.
And that's exactly what happened to Eloisa.
But as we often see, suppressed trauma has a way of resurfacing.
Years later, she starts having these bursts of anger, struggling with anxiety, especially in social situations or when she has to speak publicly.
Sometimes in ways we don't expect.
She even mentions difficulties forming relationships, particularly with men.
All things that, as the interview hints at, could be linked to that unresolved childhood trauma.
Right.
And that's where EMDR comes in as a potential way to heal.
It's fascinating, right? This idea that something like eye movements could help unlock and process those deeply buried emotions.
It's like Eloisa was searching for a way out of this shell she'd built around herself.
It sounds like Eloisa really stumbled upon something life-changing, almost by accident.
It does seem like one of those things where you think, how could that possibly work? But
Yeah.
the science behind it is actually pretty amazing.
That's what I thought.
Yeah.
So Eloisa learns about EMDR through Pillar, the psychologist interviewing her.
Right.
In fact, Pillar is the one who actually suggested she try it.
Which is really interesting because it highlights how EMDR is still relatively new, even within the field of psychology.
Yeah, Eloisa even mentions it wasn't something typically taught in psychology programs, at least not when they were studying.
Right.
You need additional specialized training to practice EMDR.
Exactly. It's not something you just pick up in your standard psych training. And second, it shows how EMDR is gaining traction as this powerful tool for addressing trauma.
Okay.
But before we get into Eloisa's personal experience with EMDR,
Yeah.
let's unpack what it actually is for our listener.
Okay.
Because, like you said, the whole eye movement thing, it's a little hard to wrap your head around at first.
Right. Like, how can moving your eyes actually help you heal from something as deep as trauma?
It all goes back to how our brains process memories, especially traumatic ones. You see, EMDR was discovered by Francine Shapiro, and her research was focused on REM sleep.
REM sleep. That's when we dream, right?
Exactly. And Shapiro noticed that during REM sleep, our eyes dart back and forth rapidly.
Mm-hmm.
She theorized that those eye movements were somehow connected to how our brains process emotions and memories while we sleep.
So it's like EMDR is tapping into that REM sleep state while you're awake.
You got it. EMDR is based on this idea that we can stimulate a similar kind of reprocessing by replicating those eye movements while we're conscious and actively recalling a traumatic event.
Okay, so during a session, you're thinking about the trauma, but you're also, say, following the therapist's finger back and forth with your eyes.
That's the basic idea.
Okay.
But let's break it down a bit further. A therapist guides you to really focus on the traumatic memory, the emotions, the physical sensations, everything, and simultaneously, you're visually tracking their hand as it moves back and forth, or sometimes they might use tapping or even audio cues, alternating sounds in each ear.
So it's not always eye movements, but there's always this bilateral stimulation happening.
You got it. That's the key. And the theory is that this bilateral stimulation, whatever form it takes, helps engage both sides of the brain, the left and right hemispheres.
And somehow all of this helps to unlock or reprocess those traumatic memories that have been stuck.
Yeah.
Like, what's going on in the brain that makes this work?
Well, the exact mechanisms are still being studied, but it seems this bilateral stimulation facilitates a kind of neurological shift.
Okay.
It's like it allows the brain to process the traumatic memory in a healthier, less distressing way. It helps us create a more balanced, less emotionally charged perspective on what happened.
It's like hitting the save button on a computer file, but you're actually resaving the memory in a new way that's less painful to access.
That's a great way to put it, and that's what makes EMDR so powerful.
Wow.
It's not about erasing memories, but changing how they're stored and accessed in the brain.
This is where it gets really wild for me. Eloisa describes going through EMDR therapy and how intensely she relived certain memories. The one that really stuck with me, of course, was her memory of her mother's death. She actually went there.
She did, and it's a really powerful example of how EMDR can work. She describes how the actual visuals of the memory, the emotion she felt, even how she perceived the people who were there with her, it all shifted during the EMDR processing.
Wow.
It wasn't about changing the facts of what happened, but the way the memory was held, you know?
It's like the memory itself was transforming in her mind.
Remember how we were talking about resaving the memory in a new way? Eloisa actually brings up this concept of dissociation, which I thought was fascinating.
But dissociation, what exactly does that mean?
So it's a psychological term, and in the context of EMDR, it often describes this feeling of observing a memory from a detached perspective, almost like you're watching a movie, instead of being right back in that experience, feeling all the emotions at their full intensity.
Oh, wow. So instead of feeling that immediate rush of emotion like you would when you typically remember something,
Yeah.
it's more like looking at a photograph.
Yes, it's like there's a layer of separation. And for someone reliving a traumatic memory, I can only imagine what a huge relief that would be.
Absolutely. And for Eloisa, this seems like a real turning point in the interview. She talks about this incredible realization she had through EMDR. She was finally able to understand and forgive her father.
It's amazing, isn't it? For years, she'd carried this anger and resentment, but EMDR allowed her to see the situation from a new perspective.
You mean forgiving him for not being able to tell her directly about her mother's death? For shutting down her grief?
Exactly. EMDR helped her recognize her father was dealing with his own pain and didn't have the tools to cope in a healthy way, let alone help her process her grief. And in understanding that she can finally let go of some of that anger, it's not about saying what he did was right, but allowing a new understanding to emerge.
That's incredibly powerful. And it makes me think about something else Pilar said about how EMDR isn't just about processing the actual traumatic event, but also addressing the lasting effects, all those negative thought patterns and limiting beliefs we can carry with us for years. It's like Eloise's shell was built not just from her mother's death, but also from the way her family dealt with it, or rather didn't deal with it.
It's so true. EMDR helps people move from a place of feeling defined by their trauma to a place of healing and growth.
It does sound like the whole process can be pretty intense, though. Eloisa mentioned having some really rough sessions, especially in the beginning.
Yes, it can be tough. EMDR therapy isn't a quick fix, and it's going to bring up a lot of difficult emotions. That's why it's so important to have a qualified, experienced EMDR therapist to guide you, someone who can create a safe space to process those emotions as they come up.
Pilar really emphasized that in the video, didn't she? That this is not something to try on your own.
Right. It's also important to remember that healing is a journey, not a destination. Even after EMDR, someone might still experience moments of anger, anxiety, or sadness related to their trauma.
Eloise even talks about still having those moments, but now she has the tools to navigate them in a healthier way.
And you know, it's inspiring that she turned her experience into something positive by writing Maldita Coroza. That act of writing and sharing her story is another layer of processing.
It really is. And who knows how many people might read her book and feel empowered to seek help themselves.
It makes you wonder, doesn't it? How many people out there are living in their own damn shells, unaware of the potential for healing and growth that's possible?
So to our listener, we'll leave you with this. What if you were to take stock of your own experiences? Could there be unresolved emotions or events from your past that are impacting how you think, feel, or behave today? It's a question worth sitting with.
It really is, because as Eloisa's journey shows us so beautifully, sometimes acknowledging and addressing our emotional pain is the first step toward real lasting change and transformation.